A few years ago, when my wife and I were expecting the birth of our son, we spent quite a bit of time talking about potential baby names. And I have something of a reputation for suggesting certain unusual names. There's a lot of great names in the Old Testament, like Zephaniah, that just don't get used very much anymore. But probably one of the names that I didn't suggest was Jesus. I mean, how could anybody measure up? But Hispanics don't seem to be quite so hesitant. Jesus seems to be fairly common. Jesus or Jesus is actually in the top 200 for boys' names in the U.S. Another name I probably didn't suggest is Benedict. Americans still associate Benedict with a traitor, Benedict Arnold, during the Revolutionary War. And you might think that some Catholics would name their kids Benedict since the previous pope took the name Benedict, but Benedict still is usually outside the top 1,000 boys' names, not really popular in the U.S. Another name that's unpopular that I'm sure I didn't suggest isn't even in the top 5,000, and that's the name Judas. Even 2,000 years after Judas Iscariot, his legacy has left that name tainted. But in the time of Jesus, it was a really popular name among Jesus' Jewish contemporaries. Judas is another form of the name Judah, which of course is one of the tribes of Israel. In fact, the major tribe of Israel in the time of Jesus. It's the tribe that King David came from. It's the tribe that Jesus came from. And not only was the name Judas a reference back to Judah, one of the patriarchs, but also one of the very popular heroes of the time between the Testaments. Judas Maccabeus was his nickname was the Hammer. He was one of the ones who had thrown off the rule of pagan oppressors about 200 years before the time of the Gospels. And so there were a lot of Jews who were naming their baby boys Judas in this time. In fact, Luke and John both tell us that not one but two of Jesus' disciples were named Judas. And one of Jesus' brothers also had the same name, Jude. Now, it's interesting that we render it Jude rather than Judas now, because we so associate Judas with Judas. It becomes synonymous with betrayal, an icon of evil. But if we simply see Judas as a villain in the story, that is, as someone unlike us, we risk blunting the sharp edge of the story's challenge to us. Yesterday at the men's breakfast, there was a devotion about Peter, and someone said, "Oh, I really identify with Peter." That's something you never hear anyone saying about Judas, right? People don't read the Gospels and say, "Man, I really identify with Judas here." But even though we should identify with Peter, this guy who's well-meaning but flawed, when we read the Gospels, we're invited to consider how much we're like each of Jesus' disciples, and that includes Judas. We're picking up again in John chapter 13 today. We had heard earlier in the chapter in verse 2, and we'll start there, that even as this scene opens where Jesus is with his disciples, it's a supper setting. Jesus is going to wash his disciples' feet. But before he does that, it says the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. That is, Judas had already been tempted to betray Jesus. We're not told why. It may be that he was greedy, that there was a profit in it for him. In fact, in the previous chapter, in John 12:6, he had objected to Mary anointing Jesus' feet with perfume. And it says, he, that is Judas, objected to this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He kept the common purse and used to steal what was put into it. So we're told he's a thief, he's greedy, maybe the money he can get from betraying Jesus, maybe this is the motive for Judas. But it's also possible, and we don't know, that Judas felt like in some way Jesus had betrayed him. Here Judas had taken the initiative to He might think to be one of Jesus' disciples. He'd followed him around all this time, and now Jesus was saying these crazy things about how he was going to go and die, right? Maybe that wasn't what Judas thought he'd signed up for. Maybe he felt betrayed by Jesus. We don't know what his motives were. But we know that already, as he sits down at the table with Jesus, actually not sitting down, we'll talk about that later, but that temptation has now metastasized into a plan that's started to form for Judas. And he's already begun to act on it. We see this in Mark and Matthew. In Mark chapter 14, verses 10 and 11, it says, "Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. When they heard it, they were greatly pleased and promised to give him money. So he began to look for an opportunity to betray him." This is before the supper. So Judas has already begun to put his plan into action. Now Jesus, as we'll see, knows that Judas is going to betray him. And yet in this scene in John 13, Jesus continues to shower Judas with love and grace. He even washes his feet. This act of humble service to the one who will betray him. Then in John 13:11, we see that Jesus, though he knew this, he still washed Judas' feet. He says that he knew who was to betray him. For this reason, he said, "Not all of you are clean." Jesus, as we saw last week, goes on to instruct his disciples to follow his example of humble service. And then he says in verses 18 and 19, and this is the beginning of our passage for today, he says, "I'm not speaking of all of you. I know whom I've chosen, but it is to fulfill the scripture. The one who ate my bread has lifted his heel against me. I tell you this now before it occurs, so that when it does occur, you may believe that I am." Psalm 41:9, and we'll look at that as well. This says, "Even my bosom friend, my very close friend, in whom I trusted, who ate of my bread, has lifted the heel against me." We'll see sharing bread is one of the things that's going to feature here in this story in John 13. This idea about lifting the heel, there's a couple of things it could mean. One is that showing the bottom of your foot to someone else was a way of essentially cursing them, of saying, bad things are going to happen to you. So you may remember when Jesus sends his disciples out, he tells them that if people reject them and their message, they're to shake the dust off their feet. Well, to do that, you're lifting up the heel. You're essentially saying, if you won't listen to my message, you're under God's curse, essentially. The other thing it could mean is that it's the idea possibly of an animal kicking the person who's feeding it. That's the idea. You're sharing bread, but you're lashing out at the same time. And so here Jesus and John prophesies his betrayal. We'll see this again more clearly in verse 21. But then he prophesies so that afterwards his disciples will remember it and know, Jesus says, that I am he. Throughout John's gospel, you get these I am sayings. I am the light of the world. I am the resurrection of the life and the life. They're references and echoes back to God's own name out of Exodus 3 and a reference to Jesus being not only Messiah but also the Lord. And so in verse 20 of John 13, this kind of wraps up. You get these themes of betrayal and service that are mixed, and this kind of wraps up his commission after the foot washing. He says to his disciples, "Very truly I tell you, whoever receives one whom I send receives me, and whoever receives me receives him who sent me." Jesus, throughout John's gospel, has said that he represents the Father, and here he says, and similarly, his disciples represent him as they go out into the world, as they follow his example of humble service. And just as people's reception of the Father was indicated by how they received Jesus, so people's reception of Jesus is indicated by how they receive the service of those who come in his name. People who welcome Jesus' disciples who welcome their service and their proclamation in his name reflect a heart that's ready to receive God's grace through Jesus Christ. And now in verses 21 and 22, Jesus turns back to speak about the betrayal. He says, after saying this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and declared, very truly I tell you, one of you will betray me. The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he was speaking. Jesus has been troubled before in John's gospel, most notably perhaps at the grave of Lazarus. Betrayal and death are things that grieve Jesus and should grieve us as well. That kind of grief flows out of love. And Jesus announces here very clearly now that he'll be betrayed. In Mark's gospel and Matthew, the disciples respond by asking Jesus one by one, surely not I. And in Matthew, it's even explicit that Judas has the audacity to say to Jesus, surely not I. Luke says that they asked one another, and here in John, they look at one another, notice, instead of looking at Jesus. Now, all of these accounts are just glimpses into this moment of shock in which every murmur, every question, every glance cuts to their hearts. Leonardo da Vinci famously sought to depict this storm of emotion in his painting, The Last Supper. I think we have an image of it. There were all kinds of Last Supper paintings in the medieval. You can maybe see a little bit of it there in that the disciples are all very active. They're turning to one another, looking at each other, trying to figure out who is it? Who is the one who's going to betray? Off to the left of Jesus, from our perspective, there's a cluster of three. The closest one to him is John. Peter's whispering to John, and then Judas kind of in front with dark hair. That's kind of the focal cluster that we're going to see here in this portrayal. So Jesus in verse 23 in John says, it says one of his disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Now you may have noticed in Da Vinci's picture, just like in other medieval pictures, people are sitting or they're standing at the table, but they're not reclining, right? Which is what they would have been doing in a first century Jewish setting of feasting. Now that may seem strange to us, but basically they would lie on their side, they would prop themselves up with their left elbow, and they would eat with the right hand. This was especially true in a case in which there's a special supper. And in this case, this may have been a Passover meal. Passover was a remembrance that the people of Israel were delivered from slavery in Egypt, and to eat by reclining was a symbol of freedom. Slaves did not eat in this way. Slaves stood when they ate or they sat, but to recline was a sign of freedom. Only free people reclined as they ate. The fact that the beloved disciple here is close to Jesus indicates that he's in a position of honor. Now, there are 13 people in the room, as far as we know, the 12 disciples and Jesus. Probably there would have been a head on one side of the table. Jesus would have been with two of the disciples, and then groups of 5 along the other side. It's hard to know exactly, but that means that the two who are next to Jesus on each side of him are in positions of honor. Now, the way Jesus would have decided this, we don't know. Jesus in other places in the Gospels kind of throws traditional orderings of honor out the window. But in any case, the beloved disciple seems to be one of the ones here that's in a position of honor. Now, this is probably the Apostle John, probably the author of the Gospel. But the label beloved disciple is intentionally anonymous. This is the first time we hear it in John. We'll hear it again. And that anonymity invites us to consider ourselves in his place, to consider ourselves also as beloved disciples close to Jesus. Because of his proximity to Jesus, someone else wants to use him to find something out, verses 24 to 25. Simon Peter therefore motioned him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. So while reclining next to Jesus, he asked him, "Lord, who is it?" Now, in the foot washing scene before, Peter has just made a fool of himself. So it may be that Peter isn't eager to make a fool of himself a second time, and that's why he kind of uses John, or the beloved disciple, to ask the question. It may also be that he thought the beloved disciple was more likely to get a straight answer. In any case, he prompts him to ask the question, and he does. "Lord, who is it?" Verses 26 and 27. Jesus answered, "It is the one to whom I give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." So when he had dipped the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. After he had received the piece of bread, Satan entered into him. Jesus said to him, "Do quickly what you're going to do." Sharing bread was a sign of intimate friendship. We saw this in the quote from Psalm 41 earlier. And notice Jesus, just as in the foot washing, even as he marks him out as his betrayer. We're already told Jesus knew Judas would betray him. He washed his feet anyway. Jesus announces here that Judas is betraying him, and he does it with a very sign of friendship. This close friendship. Jesus now puts Judas to the test, saying, "Do quickly what you're going to do." This may sound strange to us, like Jesus is commanding Judas to betray him, but that's not actually what's happening here. Jesus, of course, knows Judas is going to betray him. He's announcing that. But this is a challenge from Jesus to Judas to decide. It is, in other words, another opportunity to receive grace. Even at this hour, grace is available for Judas. But instead of receiving that grace, he gives himself over to the path he has already started down. He rejects Jesus' offer of friendship. He rejects grace. He welcomes Satan instead. Verses 28 to 30 finish up the passage we'll look at today. Now no one at the table knew why he had said this to him. Some thought that because Judas had the common purse, Jesus was telling him, "Buy what we need for the festival," or that he should give something to the poor. So after receiving the piece of bread, he immediately went out, and it was night. It's possible that Jesus' comment to the beloved disciple about giving his bread to his betrayer was only spoken in a way that only the beloved disciple could hear it, and the others couldn't quite make it out. That may be why they don't understand Jesus' instruction to Judas. They think he's just given him orders about some routine task because Judas happens to be the group's treasurer. Judas, however, responds by going out directly into the night. Now, John's gospel is full of symbolism, and everywhere in John where night or darkness are used, they always symbolize evil. Here we see Judas has forsaken the one who identified himself as the light of the world. He walks away from the light of the world and out into the darkness. That is the journey he has chosen. Now, as we think about this passage of Scripture, there are different people here that we are invited to think about their example. One, of course, is Jesus himself. Jesus is being offered to us as an example. Just as in the foot washing, he invited his disciples to do as he had done, to serve one another with the same humble service. Here also we see Jesus showing extraordinary love and grace. He knows Jesus will betray him. He knows it. He washes his feet anyway. He shares his bread with him anyway. By the way, the fact that Jesus can share bread with Judas indicates that just as the beloved disciples in a position of honor, Judas may have been the one in the other position of honor, deliberately placed close to Jesus to communicate Jesus' desire for friendship and intimacy with him. Jesus shows him love and grace even though he knows he would betray him. But this isn't just a way of pretending that nothing bad will happen or has happened or can happen, right? Showing love and grace isn't about ignoring the evil that other people are doing. It takes it very seriously. And so Jesus also, even as he shows love and grace here, he also calls on Judas to take responsibility for his choice. We're also reminded in this passage that we, our beloved disciple, is close to Jesus. We are invited also to feast at Jesus' side, to know the abundance of living in his presence and by his grace. And yet we are also warned here in this passage that we, like Judas, may be tempted. We may be tempted to spurn his love, to betray him, as we do every time we choose sin over humble service. Every time we give in to the temptation to try to hide our sin in the dark. This passage calls us to be honest with ourselves and to recognize that there is grace, there is friendship with Jesus, and we can choose that instead. He has invited us. He has entrusted us with the calling to represent him out into the world by his love and grace and truth, to live out in the light, to forsake the darkness. To do that requires courage, but it is the only good way, the way that is close to Jesus' side. And so, let's go to him now in prayer.